Thanks for having me up here today. It's a real joy to come up and speak about reclamation. And it's funny, so I've been in North Dakota for 12 years. This most recent time, 5 or 6 earlier when I was going to NDSU, and it's just a small state. And how small is it? During the intro, talking about ArtLink, and ArtLink's, generation of his we're now in his grandkids' generation. His granddaughter, one of them lives like right next to me. So it's funny how small North Dakota is. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the lignite industry today. Our role in reclamation, the vision for the future, where the industry is going over the next 10 years. And just at a glance, I wanted to cover some of these items. Really, baseload electricity is the backbone of society. Everything depends on it. And as you look, and I'm sure that Claire from the Transmission Authority can cover this in more detail than I can, but it's interesting over the past 40 years, the objectives of electricity generation have completely changed. It used to be your primary motivating factor, maybe the only thing, was low price, always on electricity. That's what consumers paid for. That's what consumers demanded. That's why co-ops sprung up, is because that's what they could provide that nobody else could provide. So we've got that in the lignite industry in North Dakota. We got about 2 million people in the upper Midwest who consume the electricity that we generate from lignite. Economic impact of nearly $6 billion, around that 13,000 direct and indirect jobs, 4,000 megawatts of dispatchable power. The regulations that have come out of the Biden administration threatened not just these plants, but the communities as well. And so the industry as we know it was and remains at significant risk. And despite the election of Donald Trump, what we're seeing is this regulatory whiplash that goes from the left to the right and back and forth, from Obama to Trump to Biden to Trump, and then what happens next. And especially when you're talking about reclamation and the timelines that are involved, that really makes it challenging. I mentioned the governing philosophy about electricity generation during the first 50 years or so of electricity generation, from let's even go back to TWA, when the federal government first got involved in the real generation of electricity, the expansion of co-ops across Texas and the rest of the country, where you knew what you were getting, you knew what that philosophy was, you knew why we were doing those things. And I just want to encourage everyone to consider the philosophy, not just of electric generation, but of reclamation itself, because I think that will help make sense of the slides that I'll go over that talk about the challenges that we face from the federal government and where we're going in the future, and where reclamation sits in that. And what is the philosophy of reclamation? You ask yourself, and Governor Link that quote give us a preview of what I was going to say, which is, why did our citizen-led legislature implement reclamation standards that we are all dealing with? Why did they do it? What is that philosophy that needs to remain constant from 50 years ago to 50 years in the future? And why are we invested in reclamation? And I think it's because we know the land and the communities will be here when we leave. And those lands, those communities are populated with our friends, our families, those people that we know. So we do it in North Dakota. Our governing philosophy about reclamation is that we truly are pursuing the sustainable and wise development of our resources, with a focus on sustainability, while protecting the land and the communities where we live and work. Now you contrast that governing philosophy to Washington, D.C. Why does Washington, D.C. take an interest in what we would call reclamation, what they might call environmental protection? What is their governing philosophy? It's inconsistent at best. And you can see that when we have this regulatory whiplash going from a governing philosophy even back to Bush, to Obama, to Trump, to Biden. Sometimes I don't care who is president, whether it's Trump, Obama, Biden. I don't think they have a consistent regulatory philosophy. certainly not one that you could talk about as consistently and clearly as we can define our governing philosophy in North Dakota with reclamation, where we have a vision that we're trying to protect the lands and the communities, sustainable development, and balance all of those attributes. One item that is very obviously missing from the federal governing philosophy is including communities and people in their definition of sustainability. You know, we talk about sustainability in North Dakota and understand that that means sustainable communities and sustainable livelihoods as much as it means sustainable environmental impact. And I think, unfortunately, at time to time, when you hear people in Washington, D.C. talk about sustainability, they don't include communities or jobs or anything like that in their definition of sustainability. They're only talking about their particular slice of environmental attributes that they look at. So what we need to do in the lignite industry is balance those values that we're pursuing with the values and the philosophy that the state has set out, and push back against the inconsistent philosophy that is pushed to us from Washington, D.C., which is, by and large, simply a pursuit of power and protection, as they define it, on these speculative environmental attributes. That's the challenge that we were really faced with, rewinding now 4 or 5 years into the Biden administration. This is the picture that was facing the lignite industry midway through the Biden administration, where we were facing a host of regulatory challenges, each one of which could have shut the industry down. The EPA, populated with this group of zealous, unelected bureaucrats, had decided, again, in the absence of any kind of comprehensive or meaningful governing philosophy, that they were going to prioritize some speculative environmental attribute above all, whether that attribute was carbon-free, whether that attribute was take your choice. They were going to prioritize that regardless of the damage that it did to the grid, damage that it did to our communities, damage that it did to the economics, people's livelihoods. And one of the things that the EPA consistently left out of that equation was the impact of their actions on the stability of the electric grid, the impact of their actions on the pricing of electricity, those things that we all depend on. The first one of those that they talked about was MATS. I always use this example because growing up in the 80s, as I did, you kind of remember the conversations about acid rain and pollution and those things. And I always say mercury falls into that category of emission where we can recognize that it is something that needs to be minimized, that it's a pollutant in the traditional sense of the word, that where we grew up thinking about like controlling and reducing pollution. And this mercury rule from the EPA started from a position where they could not define what success looked like. And it started from a demand to do work that would not benefit health and human welfare, even in the EPA's eyes. In other words, we've met every health benchmark on mercury reduction that the EPA has set out for us. We've met every health benchmark that Congress has set out for us. We've met all of those reclamation guidelines. And the EPA looked at that success and said, we don't care. We need you to do more. We ask, will doing more improve human health? And the answer was no. We cannot demonstrate that it will do more, but you need to spend the money, make the investment anyway. So that was one of these things that was going to result in millions of dollars in investments that would have no benefit on our lives, but it would significantly degrade the stability of our grid and increase electricity prices. The next one over is that blue greenhouse gas 111 rule. And make the point here that carbon dioxide is not a pollutant the way that we grew up thinking about pollution. It's almost legal. It's almost a pollutant in name only because of a series of court cases and court actions where it has been deemed to have this degradation on human health. It's not a pollutant the way we think of pollution. And the EPA puts that in the category of pollutant, even though it is completely different from any other attribute that, or any other particle that would be governed by the Clean Air Act. This one is interesting too, because we've worked very hard in North Dakota on carbon capture infrastructure. We see the control of carbon dioxide in North Dakota not as a environmental mandate given to us by the EPA, but as an opportunity that would, we believe, go hand in hand with what Justin was talking about on pipelines, oil extraction. That carbon infrastructure can be one of those elements that supercharges oil extraction and makes our economy stronger in North Dakota. So we've been working on this in the lignite industry independently of where the EPA is, and we think we have a path forward to building large carbon capture infrastructure in the state in a way that's going to provide economic dividends to the state and increase oil output. That story is not one that the EPA likes to hear, and their carbon rule was one that was more punitive than productive, and it also was intended more than anything else to bankrupt the industry, shut it down, again, without regard to where we're going with electric prices or grid stability. Then the other two I'm going to just touch on a little bit more briefly. Regional haze is not a pollutant in the traditional sense of the word either. Regional haze is a program that the government has set up to support visibility at our national parks. And I think this is one that we would probably all agree with, as well as that's something that we should be interested in, especially in this part of the state where we have access to, Theodore Roosevelt National Park. When we go there, when our friends and family go there, when people from across the country go there and enjoy North Dakota's natural resources, we want them to have a great experience, to be able to see across the park, to see the scenery that we appreciate in North Dakota. That's kind of the premise behind the Regional Haze program. Where it goes off the rails under the leadership of the EPA is something that you'll all be able to remember by just thinking about last summer when we had these fires that were just filling North Dakota's air with smoke. And the EPA's program doesn't really do a great job differentiating between wildfire visibility degradation that comes from power plants. And what our modeling has shown is that visibility degradation in North Dakota is almost never attributed to power production or oil and gas production. When we have those days where you can't see across town, probably 999 times out of 1,000, it's because of something that's happening outside our borders. Canadian wildfires, Western wildfires. The regional haze guideline that was given to us by the EPA rejected that reality and substituted their own. And once again, the answer was higher rates, more electricity instability in the grid. Coal combustion residuals is the last one that I wanted to talk on. We've been doing such a great job in North Dakota at finding alternative uses for byproducts of the coal industry. We use some of the byproducts from combustion for road construction, for ash sales, for concrete, and we continue to find more. And one of the elements that the EPA has targeted was to try to reclassify some of the coal combustion residuals as hazardous waste, which reduces the optionality when you're running a power plant and you have these high value products that maybe are going to be sold into the concrete market and be used for lowering construction prices in concrete and other building materials. And the EPA says you're unable to do that. So again, in the absence of a governing philosophy at EPA that clearly defines an objective and says this is what we need to go do, we're going to give you a suite of rules that have no impact other than making electricity more expensive and more unstable. So I've skipped that slide because it's just the things I just told you. So the common themes among these is a rejection of Supreme Court guidance that the EPA was given, where Congress is supposed to be the body that provides legislation. Congress is supposed to unveil and pass the energy program for the United States, the energy objectives, and not the EPA. The other items that are in common are an unrealistic approach about the state of technology. And EPA's viewpoint was that these technology solutions that we've been working on, for instance, in carbon capture in North Dakota for more than 10 years, we know what it takes to build them, to invest in them, to get them up and running. And it's a period of time that is closer to decades than 2 or 3 years. And in the EPA's rule, those decisions needed to be made in the next year or two, with 2032 being the deadline. We've been trying to get some of these things up and running in North Dakota, the Young Station, for instance, for 9 years, and we're making progress, but this isn't something that you can just pick up and decide as the EPA wanted us to do. Ignores the economic impacts, and it disregards cooperative federalism framework that I referenced in the beginning of this presentation about the cooperative federalism framework. Is this North Dakota philosophy? This is why North Dakota invests in reclamation. The federal government needs to listen to that North Dakota vision, and the federal government is tasked by the Constitution of working hand in hand as equals with the state to implement that shared philosophy. Absent a shared philosophy of their own from the federal government, their only approach in this has been to stumble around from left to right and leave the state trying to do the right thing, and always butting up against these administrative obstacles. So what happened in the election in November when President Trump won is those rules that I covered were basically put on hold. They continue in the background. They continue to be litigated. You'll continue to hear about them. But as that happens, we're not under the gun of being asked to make these unrealistic investments in such a short period of time. We'd continue to litigate them, and we're working to develop a framework of what this new administration might propose as far as those similar types of rules. What can we accomplish as we undertake that shared journey toward a more sustainable future in this country? What are we capable of doing, and can the federal government listen to our clearly articulated vision of sustainability and reclamation as it proposes those new roles? The other issue that's interesting that is coming out of this administration is its real clearly articulated focus that we need to be investing more in energy development in this country. They've talked about permit streamlining. They've talked about critical minerals. They've really clearly said, we want to achieve energy dominance in this country, and we're going to make it easier for you producers to produce. So while that's exciting from an energy development perspective, in the back of your head, you're also saying, what does that mean for long-term liability? What does that mean for reclamation standards? What does that mean for the economics of a project that gets underway under a real pro-energy administration like President Trump, makes long-term investments, gets permits based on a streamlined process? And what happens if the next president looks the other way? Then are you assuming liability for participating in a permitted streamlined process? Are you assuming liability for moving quickly? Are your economics still going to be the same? So despite the fact that we have a real pro-energy president at this point, it's still an uncertain future for energy, because we haven't solved the underlying problem, which is where does Congress, where can they pass a durable, long-lasting energy policy bill that is going to survive the next president, who may or may not have that same governing philosophy. And during the whole time in North Dakota, our commitment to that the state, the land, the communities remains unchanged. If you look at what our legislature is doing right now, it's trying to provide that path forward. And the obstacle continues to be, where does the federal government go? How can we integrate our vision for an energy future with where the state or with where the federal government is going? So now this post-election opportunity that exists for the industry, I think, is as great as an opportunity as I've seen for some time. We have turned a corner, I think, on the science behind carbon capture at our power plants. We know that it works. We've demonstrated the capacity to capture the carbon dioxide and move it somewhere. The next challenge is, can you make the economics work? That's not an easy question to answer. It may be a question that is unanswerable at this point, but we know the science works. That is half of the battle. And beyond just the carbon question, we also see new opportunities for revenue in critical minerals, in carbon byproducts for building materials. The types of rules that the EPA tries to weaponize in your coal ash, we can actually turn some of that into revenue streams by thinking more creatively. So there have been, as an example, about 15 different bills and initiatives in North Dakota leading the way, talking about where we think we can go with CO2 in this industry. And that long-term vision and investment provides a pathway to get from the coal plant to the oil field on one of what we think can be the next largest revenue stream for the power industry, which is this selling of CO2 into the oil fields. Turning that waste into an opportunity that can happen with a federal government that wants to develop energy resources. We also see some economic incentives for critical minerals, for carbon materials. Just in the 2023 legislative session, there was a bill passed that would authorize tax incentives for the construction of a critical mineral processing facility for critical mineral work to happen. That work is going to look very similar to what coal mining would look like. The reclamation picture is going to be very similar, with the end objective to maintain those sustainable lands and sustainable communities. But the revenue picture for that is available to our industry, to investing partners, continues to increase the revenue for the leaseholder, for the participants, for the state, taking the natural resources that we've been blessed with in North Dakota and turning them into something valuable that grows the economy. One of the things that I wanted to flag for this group that I try to talk about with anyone interested in reclamation is to keep in mind how the Lignite Research Program can improve reclamation efforts. These are things we're dealing with right now, whether it's waste disposal, whether it's figuring out new ways to develop critical minerals. We've done work in the reclamation field through the Lignite Research Program about soil compaction, for instance. The Lignite Research Program is funded through our coal severance tax and our coal conversion tax, and has provided the bulk of the funding for some of these opportunities I've talked about, whether that's coal ash, whether that's CO2, critical minerals. But I would encourage your thoughts as well. How can we use that program to make your jobs easier as you work in the reclamation field? What are the challenges that you face that we could use that Lignite Research Program to make your lives easier, to make the product better? Because we want to be a part of the reclamation continual improvement as well. So as we expand into these different areas of revenue production, whether that is critical minerals or whether that is CO2, it will change the way we approach reclamation because we'll be increasing our scope. We want to make sure that we use the same tools that we are using to increase our opportunities, to increase and improve our reclamation efforts at the same time. What we're doing at the state legislature right now is building this long-term strategy as well. A couple of years ago, we provided some tax relief for our power plants by reducing the conversion tax that was paid to the general fund. We continued paying the conversion tax to the counties, to the Lignite Research Fund, but we wanted to do something to reduce the marginal costs for our power plants. They've been struggling in markets that are sometimes dominated by subsidies at the federal level. And as Justin kind of said, natural gas production is increasing. That reduces some of the power prices as well that our members struggle with. This was one of the things that we did to provide stability to the coal industry while the markets settle, while we work on some of these regulatory challenges. But what it does is it makes our power plants more efficient. They can operate more days in the market and make sure that the economics of the market aren't chasing them out day after day after day, that we can continue to provide that baseload electricity. We continue to make program improvements to the Lignite Research Program. And once again, we want to make sure that program is being responsive to the needs of this group and improving reclamation efforts. We're also really trying to improve the county working relationships. As we look into the future, what does the lignite coal plant of the future look like? We know that we're going to have an elevated level of working relationships with the counties, with the communities, with the people. We want to make sure that those counties and those communities understand where we're going as we expand the scope of the industry beyond just a power plant. How can that benefit everybody? How can the sustainability of that operation really be its primary component and the thing that those people at the counties are seeing, and it is serving those needs? So to that end, we're trying to improve the economic data that we collect from how a growing and diversified industry is going to look. You're going to hear a little bit later from Claire about data centers. It's one of the things that is an economic opportunity for the industry, but we don't know enough about it to sit down at a county commission meeting or with a group of concerned citizens and say, hey, here's what happens when we make these investments. We think that in order to get back to that governing philosophy that I mentioned at the beginning of making sure our communities have sustainable economies, that we need to be able to better answer that question about data centers and about all of our growth opportunities. And we also need to better understand what are the next steps for critical minerals and carbon materials. When you're starting to build a critical mineral processing facility, when we can quantify what that does on the revenue side for a coal operation, we need to be able to quantify what it does for the economic impact of a community as well, or this shared vision for prosperity in our counties and our communities doesn't work if you can't both go into that with your eyes open and say, this is why these investments need to be made. So that's where we're working on during this legislative session, is those types of questions. Just quickly, here's what is on our horizon as far as emerging markets. We see critical minerals that I've talked about, building materials. We're actually studying a way right now to make, the best way I describe it, people probably have seen press board and kind of laminated products. You can build those same things lighter and more expensively, or less expensively and stronger, using coal as the primary laminated component instead of wood chips. So building materials can be made directly from coal as part of this process that we're studying. Data processing, transmission growth, carbon economy, CO2 as a commodity, increasing oil recovery, and then this plant of the future. You're going to hear more about this plant of the future over the next 5 years, because we've got a vision to answer the question of how would you build a new lignite-fired power plant in North Dakota? What would it need? How would it use a combustion cycle? It's not going to be the same type of technology that exists in even our newest power plant. What kind of gasification process would that use? For those of you familiar with Dakota gasification, they're building valuable byproducts out of the gasified coal. If you were to sit down and design that today, what would you produce? Would you produce fertilizer to feed the local ag economy? Would you produce valuable gases for manufacturing? But if you answer that question on day one before you make the investment in that gasification technology, not only does it give you a better understanding of what the economic impact is going to be, but for our purposes, it gives you a better impact of what your reclamation needs are going to be. And at the end of the day, you're basically starting reclamation on day one with a completely with a complete idea of what it's going to take to bring that that reclamation circle back to a close with the land restored to its natural condition. Continued work on the geologic storage of carbon dioxide, energy conversion facility siting. One of the challenges that we're seeing is county by counties are starting to change requirements on the planning and zoning, what they might require out of energy conversion siting. Those things are solvable challenges if we can align on where the vision takes us. And I think I've just about covered all of my slides, and I wanted to make sure I left 5 minutes or so for questions. So I just want to reiterate the importance of aligning on that vision with the industry. Where we see the industry going is a changing, more vibrant industry that is diversified away from simple power plants into different opportunities that benefit the industry itself, but also the communities, the people, and the state of North Dakota as a whole. So with that, I would take any questions that you might have. Okay, so the question was data processing. So it's a broad term. When I say data process, I'm talking about artificial intelligence, the large scale data centers. It could be anything from a crypto facility to an artificial intelligence facility to even a small localized computer center that maybe was relatively targeted for local business. But the key to all of those is to understand how that end use is going to translate into impacting the local community and the local facility that provides the electricity for it, because they each operate differently.